It's been almost 2 weeks now since I posted last. I went on vacation with my family. I've been kind of getting back into the groove of things, getting ready to review a bunch, and by a bunch I mean this many products, probably, hopefully, before the end of the year. It's going to be quite the task. So I'm a little out of practice right now for making videos, so if I mess up and have some weird verbal issues, that's why. So I apologize in advance. Audeze did send this over for a review, but they didn't pay, ask, or otherwise try and influence my review or findings in any way. So everything I say is my own opinion. This is kind of an interesting headphone. There's a surprising amount of movement on a headphone that I don't think that a lot of people really understand, including myself. So I made a first impressions video and I kind of guessed, as much of an educated guess as I can. I made an educated guess as the use case for this, but still the comments are flooded with, why would you use it for that? I'm not understanding this product. And the use case, I still don't 100% understand. I can still make the guesses for it. Now, I might be overcomplicating it, and it might be as simple as people just like a super lightweight headphone from Audeze. It does seem like Audeze is trying to definitely attack different markets and kind of fill in all the gaps that might be out there. Like right over here, they have the Audeze LCD-GX, which is a gaming headphone, which I'll be reviewing in a little bit. And so they're attacking the gaming market, and they did that a while ago with the Mobius. They already have their high-end stuff, and it looks like they're starting to get into lower and lower end in terms of price stuff. So let's go ahead and talk about the build of the LCD-1, which hasn't changed from my first impressions, but a real quick rundown in case you didn't see that. It's a plastic build. It is very lightweight. I think it's 250 grams. It does fold up like that. It's pretty convenient. These ear cups look like they're on ear, but they're actually over ear for, I would say, medium to small ears, not so much for large ears. Like they fit over my ears just fine. And it's actually a very comfortable headphone. Most of that is due to the pad quality. Not so much the top headband. That is just okay in my opinion. But the actual pads on the side are great. And the lightweight nature of this, the decent level of clamp force while not being too much, makes for a very comfortable headphone for me. This headphone has a 90mm planar magnetic driver in it. It is 16 ohms and has a sound pressure level of about 99 dB. So it's a very efficient headphone. And even going to higher end amplifiers like this iFi IDSD or that Sennheiser HDV820 or the Asgard 3 or the Topping DX7S, or even the shit hell, I don't really notice much of a sound quality difference between all three, except for this one, but this is a tube hybrid, so it's got the tubes in it. But when it comes to solid states, I don't really think you're gonna need any strong level of amplification for this device at all. Which I think some people are gonna think, I would like to see a little bit of scaling. And then some people are also gonna appreciate that they're pretty much gonna maximize this thing without spending a ton of money on amplification. So as far as build and fit and finish, while I don't think it competes with other relatively similarly priced headphones, both above and below, for total quality, it's hard to say what they did in the name of just making it super lightweight and or portable. So when you go any particular direction for portability or studio use, when you choose any of those options, you're gonna have to make a set of sacrifices, whether that's the quality of material used, the weight, or the limitations of the movement. For example, this headphone does not fold up nearly as well as the LCD-1 does. All right, so let's talk about the sound of the LCD-1, and then at the end of this, I'm gonna make a couple comparisons to some other products that you may enjoy more or less, just depending on your preferences. So the way that I view this headphone is more of a frequency pleaser. Like if you are somebody who really enjoys kind of a really complete frequency spectrum of, just top to bottom, you got bass, you got mids, you got treble, and you really like to have the complete picture from a frequency perspective, this is going to be a really, really good headphone, very intriguing headphone for a lot of the people like that. Especially for a planar. It's not particularly dark on top, which is a lot of planars can be, just depending on how they're tuned. This, starting with the treble, is a very snappy, very crisp, very clean sounding headphone. Now what's interesting is the placement of the treble in a lineup of LCDs and other headphones. So when you look at the treble on this headphone, and I'm just gonna use this as a placeholder for the LCD 2C, but I'm gonna be talking about the 2C, not the GX, because it's a very different headphone. The placement of the treble is kind of like this. So over here you have a lot of treble, and you got a lot of detail, and you got a lot of forwardness. And in the frequency response, it's gonna be kind of hiked up a little bit more than what the Audeze would. And the Audeze kind of represents the middle of the road, in my opinion, for treble forwardness and detail. And then on this side, you'd have the LCD-2C, which granted is like almost double the cost, if not around double the cost if you include tax and everything. Anyways, but if you're coming from the 2C and if you have a reference point of the 2C is kind of dark in the treble response. It's detailed, but it's just not very forward. Whereas this is more forward, but not as forward as something like the 1990s. So if you've heard the 1990s and think that they're not forward enough, which, you know, I think very few people would think that, then, you know, this is going to seem pretty dark. But if you've heard the 1990s and like a lot of people, you think, all right, it's getting up there in the treble response, then this is going to be a pretty big notch down in terms of forwardness of the treble. Now, another headphone that I consider this to be slightly behind in the treble response is going to be the Hyfman Sundara. The Sundara, I think, is a little bit faster. It's a little bit more finite, or at least it appears that way because it's a little bit more forward in the treble response and the upper levels of mid-range, whereas this is slightly less forward than that. But the treble response still feels present. It still feels available and accessible. And very, very snappy. And another headphone that this is similarly priced to, which is going to be the HD660S. I think this actually has more detail than the 660S. The S is more kind of intense, but this I think has more quantifiable detail. And I find the timbre characteristics with different levels of, especially metallic instruments, to be a lot more noticeable in the top end with this headphone than on 660S, although I really do enjoy that headphone for some other reasons. And we'll talk about that in just a second. Now for treble, I'm pretty complimentary of this. I think it's very complete. It's got a good picture without being too fatiguing, without being too forward, but you don't feel like it's really lacking. The mid-range though is gonna be kind of a complaint that I have because it has I guess what would be described as a veil over the vocals. They just don't feel as punchy and as clear as I know they can. And I'm not quite sure what causes this, but there really is there seems to be like a layer between the vocals and your ear that the treble response and the bass response doesn't seem to have. And it's just like this little bit of fuzziness that I can't quite get over. Now, when you're just listening to this headphone, you kind of get a little bit of brain burn in and you don't really notice it all that much. But it's one of those things where comparison is kind of the death of it there, because when you listen to a 660S or even a 58X or this DT1990, the vocals are just so much clearer on that than they are on here. This headphone just has a veil to the mid-range that I cannot get over. And I don't think it would bug everybody. I think you could listen to this and not really have a problem, especially if you don't have a lot of comparable headphones. But that is one thing that, well, really, it's the only fault that I can find in this headphone. The only thing that I genuinely don't like. Okay, so bass response. Bass response is fairly dynamic, fairly clear, but it's going to be a bit of a step down in forwardness from some other LCDs. So really, if you come from either a 2C, an X, a 3, a 4, any of those LCDs are going to have a lot more bass than this, and that's kind of where this would fall behind in comparison to those much more expensive headphones. So it's a little bit unfair there. This actually more has a bass response somewhat similar to the 660S and the Sundara, where it's kind of even with the mid-range. It doesn't really have any sort of big bumps or boosts in the bass response, so it's not this really bassy, thick-sounding planar headphone that a lot of the other Audeze headphones can sound like, where they can have this great, big, broad wall of bass. This doesn't really have that. It's a little bit less than that. Now, I wouldn't call it anemic or thin in the bass response, but I do think that it could be a little bit more, although what is there is, seemingly a sacrifice for cleanliness and quality over quantity. And on this particular headphone, because of the kind of the clarity of the treble response and kind of just how this sounds in general, I'm okay with that sacrifice in here. I didn't think this needed to be a bass monster, especially because Audeze already makes headphones that are so good for bass already. I like the change of pace here, that it's not just like a lesser quality version of the higher priced headphones. Now, imaging and soundstage, imaging is fantastic. Soundstage though is particularly weak for the price. It really doesn't soundstage that much at all. Some of my reference albums for soundstage are Amber Rubar's Sessions from the 17th Ward and Yoshi Hirakawa's Spaces. And those can really sound wide on most headphones, even not particularly wide headphones, but they're so well created that they'll provide that illusion anyways. Not with this headphone. Everything seems like it's coming from here. And then, in between, it's got this great layer of imaging. But the weird thing is that it's also not as intimate as something like the 660S that I brought up earlier, or the 650 or the 600. It doesn't have that layer of intimacy where everything is kind of happening inside your brain. It kind of seems like this field where everything is happening, but it's all between the ear cups and not really anything presenting the illusion of being outside that, despite being an open back headphone. And that will kind of lead me into my conclusion about sound here. In a weird way, this almost sounds like a closed back headphone. It doesn't really go far beyond. You can hear a little bit of the outside noise, but it doesn't sound particularly open. And I think the reason why it doesn't sound open is that kind of mid-range veil where it seems like there's just something between you and the vocals where it just isn't very transparent. But admittedly, while that bugs me, I don't think everybody's going to be bothered by it. And it is a very, very good headphone in a lot of other categories besides mid-range. When you talk about like dynamics or clarity, especially with the treble response is just beautiful on this headphone. Bass response is going to be right on the money for some and a little bit lacking for others. Soundstage is a little bit disappointing, but I think that the great imaging kind of makes up a little bit for that loss to kind of balance that area out. It's not particularly anything to write home about, but it's also not a downside in my opinion. Okay, so some pros and cons for some headphones that I think are perhaps a little bit better or a little bit worse in different areas for this. And we're going to go ahead and start with the headphone right here, DT1990. Now, if you want soundstage and bass and an overall like very, very complete, although occasionally harsh headphone, I think the 1990 Pro is the way to go. It's got this great ability to seem incredibly clear at the sacrifice of pretty active treble, and it can be pretty harsh for some, including myself. Now the Sundara, which is about the same price as this, fits somewhere in between these two. It's less mobile, so it doesn't have as mobile and foldable as a build, but it is made of metal, as is the 1990, or at least parts of it are. Now it's more mid-range and treble focused, not as much treble as this, but more than this. But I think this is a more even headphone, whereas the Sundara kind of has that kind of higher end tilt. The 1990 is more of a V shape. This is more kind of a straighter line across the entire frequency response. And then the last headphone I want to talk about is the 660S. This is more, again, straight line, whereas the 660 is a little bit more focused in the mid-range, as we all know by now. So why did I bring up all those headphones specifically? Well, there's two things that I think if you care about either one or both, if you prioritize either one in what you want from a headphone, then I recommend going for any of those. And that is vocals and soundstage. If you have a strong preference towards either of those things, I think the LC1 is not going to be the headphone for you. If you're more of a frequency chaser, if you want really clear sounding highs without being too forward, and if you want kind of an overall, all around jack of all trades type of performer, I think the LCD-1 is the way to go. Or if you like the efficiency or the foldability of the build. And for some people, that's going to be a big selling factor. If you're going to be judging price based off of sound alone, to be completely forward with you, I don't see this as a $400 headphone. I see this as around a $300 headphone is right around where I think this competes. It's got some very, very good features, but it's also got some features that I don't think are that good. And it's kind of a balancing act there where it's like, yeah, but it's got this, and it's like, yeah, but it also has this. And it's got this, and it's got that too. So it's not a perfect performer. Now, the build quality is going to be another point of contention for a lot of people, where some people are going to look at this and say, okay, well, it's a plastic build compared to some of the metal builds of the competitors, therefore the build isn't as good. And I would say that is true from one perspective, but if you shift your perspective towards mobility and lightweight and ease of use and just being able to go anywhere with it, the plastic foldable build is a huge selling factor for some people. And while it may not be as good for quality, it does have the added benefit of having completely different use case and completely different mobility than most other headphones, at least from the ones I talked about. So the reason why I bring this up is because sound I can kind of place into a price bracket, but I'm not sure about the build. It's gonna really come down to your specific use case, and only you are gonna know your circumstances and what you may or may not use this for. So I think that's gonna be my conclusion of the LCD-1. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Visit the Patreon if you want early access to videos like this. Look at the t-shirt shop if you want a little something for the holidays to keep you warm, stuff like that. And once again, I want to thank Audeze for sending this out for review. And until the next video, my name is Josh, signing off.